Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive? We're tackling genetics and evolution today. Got a whole bunch of study guides and test booklets here. We're going to break it down, help you guys totally crush that upcoming exam.
Yeah, should be a good one. It's all about DNA and how life on Earth has changed over time. Pretty amazing stuff, really.
Totally. It's like this hidden code, right? And once you understand it, it's like, bam,
Yeah.
we see the world in a whole new way.
I like that, unlocking the code.
So, got to start with DNA. It's like the instruction manual, right? The blueprint for life.
Exactly. Just like a blueprint tells you how to build a house, DNA has all the instructions for building and running a living organism.
Makes sense. But what's it actually made of? How does it store all that information?
Think of a ladder, but twisted. That spiral shape, that's the famous double helix. The sides are made of sugar and phosphate. And the rungs, those are the interesting part.
The rungs are where the code is.
Exactly. Each rung is made of two molecules called bases. And there are four types: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Ever heard of those?
Oh, yeah. ATGC from back in biology class. But what makes them special?
They always pair up in a specific way. A with T and G with C. Always. That's how DNA copies itself, making sure each new cell gets a complete set of instructions.
Okay, yeah. Replication. So it's not just like photocopying, huh? It's more complicated.
Yay, more. DNA replication is called semi-conservative. Each new DNA molecule keeps one of the original strands and then builds a brand new matching strand. Pretty neat, huh?
Whoa. So it's like unzipping the ladder, keeping one side, and then building a whole new other side.
Exactly. That way, the genetic code is passed down perfectly from one generation to the next. No mistakes, or at least very few.
Amazing. Okay, so DNA, our blueprint, check. But how do we get from this code to actual traits? Like eye color, height, all that.
That's where genes come in. There's specific sections of DNA that code for particular traits. Think of them like chapters in that instruction manual.
Gotcha. So genes determine everything from blood type to your risk of certain diseases.
Yep. But here's the thing. If everyone has the same genes, why don't we all look the same?
Good point. We all have like a gene for eye color, but some people have blue eyes, some have brown. Why is that?
Alleles. They're like different versions of the same gene. So the gene for eye color can have an allele for blue eyes, an allele for brown eyes, and so on.
So like different flavors of the same gene. That makes sense.
Now, some alleles are dominant and some are recessive.
Right, dominant and recessive. Like if you have a dominant allele, it kind of overrides the recessive one.
Exactly. Remember that example in the study guide about the Himalayan rabbits?
The ones with the different fur colors.
Yeah. If a rabbit has two dominant alleles for pigmentation, they have dark fur. But if they have two recessive alleles, they're all white.
That's coming back to me now. So how do we figure out what traits an offspring might inherit? It sounds complicated.
It can be. But that's where Punnett squares come in. Remember those from biology class?
Yeah, vaguely. Like a grid, right?
They're a way to visualize and predict the possible combinations of alleles from each parent. Helps you figure out the odds of different traits showing up in the offspring.
Oh, that's helpful. Okay, so we've got how traits are inherited, but what about how those traits change over time?
You're talking about evolution. And one of the key drivers is natural selection. Survival of the fittest. Heard that one.
Oh, yeah, but it's not just about being strong, right?
Not at all. It's about how well an organism's traits allow it to survive and reproduce in its environment.
So, like, if a trait helps an organism blend in better or find food easier, that's an advantage.
Got it. And those with advantageous traits are more likely to pass those traits on to their offspring. Over time, that can lead to big changes in a population.
Like in that test booklet with the rock pocket mice.
Yeah.
Light mice and dark mice, right?
And the ones on dark rocks. The dark mice are harder to spot, so they survive better.
So over time, you see more dark mice in those areas. Fascinating.
It's like the environment is shaping which traits are more successful.
Whoa. But where do those variations come from in the first place? Is it all just random?
That's where mutations come in. They're like typos in the DNA code. Remember how we said DNA is like a blueprint?
Yeah, the instruction manual.
Imagine a recipe with a little error. That's a mutation.
So if DNA is the instruction manual, mutations are like accidentally changing a word or two in the recipe. Could be bad.
Sometimes, yeah. But they can also be neutral, no effect at all, and sometimes they can actually be beneficial.
Wait, really? So a typo in the instruction manual could actually make things better.
Exactly. Mutations are the source of all that genetic variation. And that variation, that's what natural selection acts on. Without mutations, evolution would just stop. Nothing to select from.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. So mutations are actually super important for evolution.
Totally essential. They're what keeps things interesting and allow life to adapt to all sorts of different environments.
So beneficial mutations, what's an example of that?
Think about those Himalayan rabbits again. Imagine a mutation that makes them all white.
In a forest, that's probably bad. Easy for predators to spot.
Right. But in a snowy environment, that white fur is a huge advantage. Helps them blend in, avoid those predators.
So a mutation that's beneficial in one environment might be harmful in another. It all depends. This is incredible.
That's evolution for you. Always adapting, always changing.
So evolution is basically the gradual change in species over many generations, right? The grand story of life on Earth.
Exactly. And we have so much evidence to support it, like fossils.
Yeah. Fossils, they're like snapshots of the past, right?
Yeah.
You can actually see how organisms have changed over millions of years. It's amazing.
And we have homologous structures, shared features that point to a common ancestor. And then there's DNA comparisons. We can see how closely related different species are just by looking at their DNA.
It's like all these pieces of a puzzle fitting together to tell this incredible story of life on Earth.
It's a pretty amazing story, isn't it?
Totally. Okay, we've covered a lot. DNA, genes, alleles, natural selection, even a bit about fossils. But before we go any further, I think we need to talk about speciation. How does one species become two?
Yes. Speciation. That's where things get even more interesting.
So how does it happen? What are the mechanisms?
Well, there are a few different ways, but one common one is geographic isolation. Imagine a population of animals that gets separated, maybe by a mountain range or a large body of water.
So like those Himalayan rabbits again, separated by mountains.
Exactly. Now, each population might experience different environmental pressures, leading to different adaptations.
And eventually they could become so different that they can't even interbreed anymore.
And voila, you've got two new species.
Wow. It's incredible how those processes have shaped all the diversity of life we see around us today.
And it's still happening. Evolution is an ongoing process, always shaping and reshaping life on Earth.
I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But before we dive deeper into the mechanisms of DNA, I think we need to take a break and let everyone process all this incredible information. We'll be right back. All right, back to DNA. We talked about it being like the blueprint, the instruction manual, but how does that blueprint actually get used? How do we go from like a gene on a DNA molecule to, an actual trait?
Yeah, that's the part I always get a little lost in. It's like, we have the code, but how does it actually build a living thing? What are the steps?
Well, it's a multi-step process, kind of like a recipe, a really complex one. First, you got to make sure every cell gets a full copy of that DNA blueprint. That's replication. Remember, we talked about that.
Right.
But then we need to zero in on specific genes, the individual instructions within the DNA.
Right, because each gene codes for something specific. But a cell doesn't need all those instructions all the time, does it? Nope. It's like you don't need the recipe for cookies when you're making pasta. So the next step is called transcription. It's where a specific gene gets copied into a format that's easier to work with to actually build stuff. And that format is called messenger RNA, mRNA.
So it's like making a copy of just the recipe you need.
Yeah.
Instead of lugging around the whole cookbook.
Perfect analogy. And then we have translation. That's where that mRNA recipe is used to build a protein. And proteins, those are the workhorses of the cell. They do all sorts of important things.
Wait, so it goes DNA to RNA to protein, like a chain of command.
You got it. And this whole process, it's happening constantly in every living cell. Pretty amazing, huh?
Mind-blowing. But let's zoom in on those steps a bit. I think it'll help, for the exam.
Sure thing. Where should we
Well,
start?
transcription, I guess. We've got that mRNA copy, but how does that actually work?
Okay, so for transcription, there's this enzyme called RNA polymerase. It binds to the DNA at the start of a gene, reads the sequence, and then builds a complementary mRNA molecule.
So if DNA polymerase is like the master builder for replication, this RNA polymerase is more like a scribe.
I like that, the scribe of the cell.
And once that mRNA molecule is all set, it heads out of the nucleus and into the cytoplasm, right?
Exactly, to meet the ribosomes.
Ribosomes, the protein factories.
Those are the ones, they read that mRNA sequence and use it to put amino acids together in the right order to build that protein.
Oh, yeah. Each three-letter sequence, a codon, codes for a specific amino acid. It's like a secret code.
Exactly. And then we've got transfer RNA, or tRNA. That acts like a delivery service, bringing the right amino acid to the ribosome based on the mRNA codon.
So it's like this whole intricate assembly line. DNA provides the blueprint, mRNA carries the instructions, ribosomes are the construction site, and tRNA brings in the building blocks.
I like that. A well-oiled machine. It's an incredibly efficient system.
This is happening in every cell of every living thing. It's amazing.
It really highlights how all life on Earth is connected. We all use this same basic code, even though the specific genes and proteins vary from species to species. But remember, we've been talking about genes coding for single traits, but it can be more complicated.
You mean like those polygenic traits? I saw that in the study guide.
Exactly. Things like human height, those are polygenic traits. They're influenced by tons of genes, maybe even thousands, all working together. And then you have environmental factors on top of that, like nutrition.
So it's not just nature, it's nurture too.
You got it. Both play a role.
Wow, it's amazing how this all works. And I'm seeing how all these concepts we're discussing, like DNA structure, protein synthesis, polygenic traits, it's all connected. But, phew, gotta admit, my brain's getting a little full. We've covered a lot, and I know we still have to talk about all that evidence for evolution. Maybe just a quick recap of what we've learned so far. Make sure I'm solid on these concepts.
Of course. Take a breather. It's always good to review. What parts are you feeling a bit unsure about?
DNA structure and replication, I think I've got that down. Genes coding for traits, yeah, that makes sense. But I'm still a little fuzzy on that whole transcription and translation process. Maybe a different way to think about it.
All right, let's see. How about this? Imagine DNA is like a master recipe book. It's locked in a vault. That's the cell's nucleus. Each recipe in the book, that's a gene. And when the cell needs to make a specific protein, it sends a messenger, that's the mRNA, into the vault to copy the recipe.
Okay, I'm following. So the mRNA is like a copy of the recipe that can leave the vault.
You got it. Then the mRNA takes that copy to the kitchen, that's the ribosome, where the chef, the tRNA, uses the instructions to put all the ingredients, the amino acids, together in the right order. And that creates the dish, which is the protein.
Okay, that makes more sense. So the mRNA is like a messenger carrying the secret code from the vault to the kitchen. The tRNA is the chef deciphering the code and putting it all together. And the ribosome is the kitchen where the magic happens.
Exactly. Did that help?
Yes, definitely. It's amazing how this whole process is happening constantly in every cell. It's like a tiny little city.
It's quite the operation. And it's all thanks to the power of evolution that such a complex system exists.
Okay, I feel way better about that now. So, ready to tackle that evidence for evolution.
Let's do it.
All right, so we've tackled DNA replication, transcription, translation, all those crazy processes inside our cells. But how do we actually know all this is really happening? I mean, how do we know evolution is actually like a thing? What's the proof?
That's a great question. And the cool thing is we have a ton of evidence from all different areas of science that points to the same conclusion. Evolution is the real deal. It's what's behind all the amazing diversity of life we see around us.
Okay, so what kind of evidence are we talking about?
Well, for starters, there's the fossil record.
Right, fossils, like those preserved remains of ancient organisms. I remember seeing some awesome dinosaur fossils at a museum once. It's like, whoa, looking back in time.
Exactly. And by studying those fossils, we can see how life has changed over millions of years. Like we can literally trace the lineages of organisms, see how they've evolved. We even find transitional fossils, the ones that show how new features developed over time.
So we can see evolution happening right there in the rocks.
Pretty much. A great example is the evolution of horses. We have a super detailed fossil record that shows how their size, their teeth, their hooves all changed as they adapted to different environments over millions of years.
Whoa! So we can actually see how those ancient horses changed over time. That's awesome. But fossils aren't the only evidence, right?
Nope, not even close. We also have comparative anatomy that's looking at the similarities and differences in the body structures of different organisms.
Okay, yeah, I remember that from biology class.
One of the key things we look at are homologous structures. These are features that share a common underlying structure, even if they have different functions. Like, think about the arm of a human, the wing of a bat, and the flipper of a whale.
Whoa, yeah. Totally different animals, totally different ways of using those limbs.
But when you look at the bones, they're arranged in the same basic pattern. One upper arm bone, two lower arm bones, a bunch of little wrist bones, then the digits. Pretty wild, huh?
That's so cool. It's like they all came from the same basic design, but they've been modified over time to do different things.
Exactly. And it's pretty strong evidence for common ancestry, even though those animals look and behave so differently now.
Okay, so we've got fossils, we've got comparative anatomy. What else?
How about embryology? That's the study of how organisms develop before they're born. It turns out lots of different organisms go through similar developmental stages, even if they end up looking totally different as adults.
Seriously? Like what?
Well, for example, all vertebrate embryos, even humans, have gill slits at one point. even though only fish and amphibians keep their gills as adults.
Whoa, that's wild. It's like we all start out kind of similar, but then we specialize as we develop.
Exactly. It points to a shared evolutionary history, a common ancestor that had those features.
Okay, so we've got fossils, anatomy, embryology. Anything else?
Oh yeah, don't forget molecular biology. That's where things get really precise. We can compare DNA and protein sequences from different organisms, and by looking at the similarities and differences, we can figure out how closely related they are. It's like a super accurate family tree, but for species.
Wow, that's amazing. So it's like multiple lines of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion. Evolution is real. It's the story of how life on Earth has unfolded over billions of years.
Exactly. And it's a story that's still being written. Evolution is ongoing. We're all part of this grand experiment.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It really is. And it makes you appreciate the interconnectedness of all life on Earth.
Well, we've covered so much ground today. DNA, genes, mutations, natural selection, all those crazy processes inside ourselves. And then all that evidence for evolution. It's a lot to absorb, but I feel like I've learned so much.
I'm glad to hear that. Remember, this is just a starting point. There's a whole universe of knowledge out there about genetics and evolution, but you've got a solid foundation now.
Yeah, I feel way more confident about that exam now, for sure. And honestly, I'm even more curious to learn more.
That's the best part. The more you learn, the more you realize how much there still is to discover. And that's what makes science so exciting.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us today and for sharing all your knowledge.
My pleasure. And to everyone listening, good luck on your exams. Keep those brains firing.
And remember, never stop exploring the fascinating world of science. Until next time, stay curious.